A family's Christmas celebration took a very dark turn when multiple people died after eating a holiday cake that may have been laced with arsenic. What first seemed like just a tragic accident soon turned into something far more sinister. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey, so before we go any further on this, I have a big announcement for you guys. The video version of Sidebar is now available on Spotify. That's right. We are so thankful for your guys' support of Sidebar. Us getting this show on Spotify video is just truly due to how loyal this audience is. So thank you so much for that. And yes, you can now watch and listen on the go, from Diddy to the United Healthcare murder updates to crazy court moments. It is all on Spotify. So right now, you can scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description to follow Sidebar on Spotify. Well, in what is just an absolutely horrific turn of events, 3 members of a Brazilian family are dead and 3 others are hospitalized, fighting for their lives in intensive care after apparently eating a traditional homemade Christmas cake. Yeah, this is a tragedy that has sent shockwaves through the small town of Torres in southern Brazil. And this cake, it's a beloved holiday treat known as Bolo de Natal. It is similar to a fruit cake, and now it is at the center of this investigation. And now, speaking of which, another woman in the family has been arrested on suspicion of triple homicide and attempted homicide. We're talking about 42-year-old Deise Moura, the daughter-in-law of one of the victims. So there's quite a lot to unpack here. We're going to start at the beginning with a little bit of the family tree. So we have 3 sisters who were named in this tragic event, this is according to Brazilian police. We have 61-year-old Zeli Silva de Anos, 58-year-old Maida Flores de Silva, and 65-year-old Nueza Silva dos Años. So Zeli reportedly made the Christmas cake, served it to her family on the afternoon of December 23rd, but not long after, Maida, Nueza, and Nueza's daughter, 43-year-old Tatiana, got very, very sick. They were rushed to a hospital. They quickly got worse. Tatiana and Maida, they died from heart attacks that same day. That's according to the hospital. And as reported by the Daily Mail, Nueza died on Christmas Eve due to, quote, shock after poisoning. Zeli was in intensive care for days, but the Daily Mail reports that she's been moved to a regular ward. But here's the thing. They weren't the only ones to eat that cake. Maida's husband, Jefferson, and Tatiana's 10-year-old son, Matthias, also had to go to the hospital, although they were reportedly later released. Now, this cake that they were eating, which, as I mentioned, is this Brazilian traditional Christmas cake known as Bolo de Natal, has been a staple in the family celebrations for years. The cake, which means Christmas fruit cake in Portuguese, typically had a mix of dried fruits, nuts, often a liquor like brandy to soak the fruit. And Zeli had baked the cake with her sister, and it was enjoyed year after year. Nothing like this ever happened. In fact, a close family friend told a Brazilian media outlet and emphasized that there had never been any problems with this cake in previous years, saying it was a traditional family cake, a king's cake, which they always made. But unfortunately, this year's cake, it seemed to carry something far more sinister than just the usual festive ingredients, because according to the lead investigator, Marcos Veloso, while they were eating this cake, several family members noted a, quote, spicy and unpleasant flavor, a detail that became crucial to this investigation. And Velos told CBS News that the woman who baked the cake asked everyone to stop eating it. But by then, it was too late. Brazil's civil police started tests to figure out what was the cause of death here, and their initial results were shocking. The investigation quickly turned to the possibility of intentional poisoning when dangerously high concentrations of arsenic, a toxic substance commonly used in poison, was found in the bodies of the women who had died. So I want to stop right here. I want to bring on our special guest to talk more about this. To help me break it down, I'm joined by Mary Jumbelic, a forensic pathologist, former chief medical examiner of Onondaga County, New York. Thank you so much for coming on. What a story here. So I just want to get a basic understanding about arsenic. If you can tell us, can you break down for us what exactly is arsenic? What are its properties? What should we be thinking about with arsenic?
Well, arsenic's been around for a very long time, and it's commonly found in water all over the world. And the most common source of poisoning from arsenic is contaminated water. That being said, it's tasteless and odorless, and interesting in this circumstance that there was a bitter and spicy taste to the cake because it was probably in a pesticide form, and that so the other ingredients in the pesticide may have had some taste to it. The arsenic itself is tasteless.
That's so interesting, because when you were saying that, I'm thinking, well, maybe it was just water used for the flour or something like that. But you're saying if they experienced an unpleasant and spicy taste, it was arsenic found in some sort of chemical.
Probably ant poison, another type of pesticide, perhaps. I think the very fact that 6 people were ill, 3 dead very quickly, points to poisoning, or definitely a toxic exposure, certainly. And I can see why the police would be very interested in, looking at that.
Talk to me about what arsenic poisoning looks like. How does it present itself in the body, both in terms of symptoms and autopsy findings?
Well, when it's a very acute exposure, you get a very high level quickly, say, by an intentional poisoning with a pesticide, then rapidly death can occur. So it affects the GI system, the lining of the GI system. So there's vomiting, watery diarrhea right away. There can be abdominal cramping, muscle cramping, as well as tingling and numbness in the nerves. As that progresses, you get shock and heart failure. So the fact that you mentioned 2 of the victims were listed as dying from a heart attack makes perfect sense, because you get a kind of rapid dehydration with the arsenic. You lose the water inside your blood vessels. It goes into other parts of your body, and you have heart failure, electrical disturbance. The doctors at the hospital can also look at other blood tests too, if they suspect arsenic. So they can look at your blood cells by drawing a little bit of blood and looking at it under a microscope, and they can see certain details in the red blood cells that might point to arsenic poisoning. Also, it affects your blood cells, so you lose your white blood cells, your red blood cells, your platelets, and that would show up on lab tests at the hospital. After someone survives an arsenic poisoning, you can get changes in your nails, in your fingernails, where it stops the growth plate, and they're called Mies lines, and you can see white lines across the fingernails of arsenic poison victims.
Wow, so there's so many telltale signs of being able to determine that there was an arsenic poisoning, a potential cause of death. And I think here, not only was there potentially arsenic present, but apparently, based on the reporting, these levels were so high that they were considered lethal, according to police official Marcos Veloso. I mentioned before, he confirmed the findings at a January 6th press conference. Now, Margaret Mittman, who is the director of the General Institute of Expertise in Brazil, said during the conference, this is not a natural contamination. The arsenic levels are so high that it's impossible to consider this anything but poisoning. And forensic experts say that the concentration ranged from 80 to 350 times the limit for food consumption. As for how it got into the cake, investigators revealed it was found inside the flour. So an analysis was done on the flour, and the levels were reported to be 2,700 times higher than the acceptable limit. Mary, what are your thoughts on those levels? How much can a person actually ingest of arsenic before it becomes poisonous or lethal?
Arsenic, as I said, is commonly found throughout the world, and it's highest in groundwater and also in seafood. So if someone, routinely eats like a lot of seafood that's recovered from an area where there is arsenic, they're going to have a little bit of a higher level in their blood. But we can tolerate a certain amount without a problem. But a concentrated amount of arsenic, as little as 200 milligrams, can be fatal to an adult. In this case, I don't know the numbers. I know they're saying higher than this and higher than that, but it certainly sounds like it wasn't questionable that they were able to test a very high level in the flour, a very high level in the urine of the victims, and determine that they had been exposed.
And look, the key question becomes in a legal case, is it accidental or is it intentional? And when you're looking at that from your position, what would lead you to is it the concentration of it? You mentioned, I think the aspect about the taste is so key. But what could be some ways that, investigators might be looking at this and saying, well, first we have to rule out it could be accidental. Talk to us about that.
Well, poisoning is always a very, very difficult death to, prove how someone was exposed, simply because there's a delay sometimes between the action of poisoning something and someone experiencing it. And in this case, I don't know when the cake was baked, an hour before, a day before. And so you have the delay between the poisons placed inside, the cake and then the person eats it. So that's law enforcement, and that's the, prosecutorial branch. They have to connect those two pieces in time, but you can certainly establish that there's the acceptable limit is well past any accidental contamination that's in the flour.
Right.
You can establish, even tell the difference between the ant poison and then the groundwater arsenic. So if they're doing tests to speciate it and determine the difference between organic and inorganic arsenic, and that might be very important, and they, may go ahead and prove that it didn't come from the groundwater.
How would you go about collecting and analyzing the food? What are the tests that you run to detect toxins like arsenic?
Well, they're going to work with a very specialized toxicology laboratory, and they're going to collect probably all the ingredients of the cake, since the cake seems to be the focus of what everyone commonly ate. And the one person that didn't eat it did not get sick. That's very good evidence that it was in that food substance. Whatever the ingredients are in that cake, the sugar, the flour, the milk, they'll test all of those things. And then in terms of the exposure for the environment, they should test the groundwater that the family uses just in their normal, drinking habits. They'll do all of that and they'll hone it down. It sounds like they have done some of that, and that they honed it down to the flour itself. I'm sure they're doing a search also to see if there's any pesticide around. Did the family use it? Was there a farm nearby? All of that goes into the investigation.
Right. So let's talk about who may have introduced this tainted flour to the holiday celebration. So I mentioned before, investigators landed on Deise Moura, Zelly's daughter-in-law, as their suspect. According to police, she had been researching terms related to arsenic on Google in the days before this happened. And investigators have also alluded to some sort of family feud, possibly between Deise and Zelly. They haven't really gone into specifics about it, but a family member also spoke to CNN Brazil, confirming the long-standing rifts between Deise and her in-laws. And Deise's lawyer told Brazilian media earlier this week, everything's all very preliminary. There are still questions to be answered. What is the causal link between the poison and Deise? There is no explanation of how the flour ended up in Zelly's house or where or how it was acquired. There are minimal questions to indicate the authorship of the facts. Instead, all we have are the accounts of some family members and a supposed extraction of data from a mobile phone. Now, Regional Security Minister Sandro Caron said at a press conference, we have very strong indications that the person who's been arrested is the perpetrator. Some details cannot yet be disclosed so as not to hinder the continuity of the investigation, but we have obtained very good information pointing to the person who was arrested yesterday being the perpetrator and acting maliciously. And when asked about this apparent feud that was going on that goes back apparently 20 years, her attorney said Deise never hid the fact that she had disagreements with her mother-in-law. Mary, you're hearing the different responses here. You're hearing a potential defense here and the potential family conflict. What goes through your mind as we're trying to make sense of this?
Well, just looking at the circumstances, the very initial, 7 people are gathered eating this cake as 6 people become ill. So the one person that's not ill would be a suspect, just from that perspective, however the police investigation carries on. And then the other person who is a suspect is the person that made the cake, even though she also was ill and, is recovering from the arsenic poisoning. Of course, I'm sure the detectives are on that and interviewing and have established that those people weren't involved, and now they've honed in on someone for whatever reasoning they have, and it's going to behoove them to establish that person had access to the flour and link the flour to that person, however they are able to do that.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, the story doesn't end there, because there is this other shocking twist I have to talk about. So the investigation has now launched into another death. And this is the death of Zelly's husband, 68-year-old Paolo Luiz. This happened just a few months ago. What was the cause of death there? Food poisoning. Now, at the time, his death wasn't considered suspicious, but given this newly uncovered evidence of arsenic poisoning in the cake, police have now reportedly decided to exhume his body for further testing. And Detective Alyssa confirmed that his death is now being considered a possible homicide. This is according to the Brazilian outlet O Globo. Mary, talk to me about exhuming a body. What procedures would you have to follow to safely exhume and examine the body in such a situation?
Yes, I read in some media reports that both Zelly and her husband were ill. Zelly recovered. Zelli, who made the cake, recovered from the September incident, but the husband died in it. I think in this case, they will exhume the body. It will depend on how well the body was prepared for burial, how it looks when it comes back out of the ground, but it'll be like a reverse burial. They'll go to the grave site, dig up the dirt, bring up the coffin, take it to the medical examiner's office or morgue, and then perform an autopsy. In this case, they'll probably try to get hair and fingernails and things like that. But the problem is, if he died very acutely from the arsenic, that's not going to be as helpful because it concentrates in the blood quickly and then into the urine, and it takes a while before it would get into levels in the hair. But that's what they'll do. And I don't know if an autopsy was done the first time he was pronounced and then buried. So if an autopsy wasn't done, then the organs will be in better condition because they won't have been examined yet. Exhumations are difficult. You don't know the state of the body until you're really in there and you can see it. But they'll do their best, and they can at least rule out other toxins at the time as well.
Can I expand upon that? If I'm understanding correctly, there could be a difficulty of detecting a substance like arsenic in an exhumed body like this. Would there be other toxins that would be more easily detectable, or again, given the nature of his death, and we don't know if there was a poisoning whatsoever, but given the nature of his death, are you suggesting that it might be difficult to determine whether he was poisoned at all?
It might be difficult. Not impossible, but it might be difficult, because if he was preserved in a normal funereal process, then there would be chemicals that are injected into his body, formalin and perfumes and substances to preserve the body.
Right.
For the viewing and then, burial. So if that happens, there's a lot of chemicals inside the body. And so you have to differentiate those from the poisonous substances. Also, if he had an autopsy done already, then the organs are going to be cut up and they were looked at. And now you've got that in a decomposing situation. So they might not be as valuable to test. Exhumations for like chronic poisonings, it's better. For arsenic, if it was a chronic poisoning done over time, then that might be very useful from the hair and fingernail such. But if it was acute, it might not be as helpful.
And you mentioned something at the beginning of our conversation when you said what could be detectable, what can't be detectable in terms of, something might be odorless or tasteless. Mm-hmm. Is there a way that if there was an autopsy performed on him at the very beginning, it might have not have been detected by the medical examiner? It might have, it's just something that they might not have been able to see at the time. And now we're going into it a little, obviously you mentioned the difficulties now going back, but is there something that it would have evaded detection?
Yes, I think with poisoning, it's always extremely difficult. It starts with a suspicion of it because it can mask, it looks like a GI upset, it looks like a heart attack. There's just so many expressions that it can appear as a natural death. And the suspicion should have arisen because both of them were ill at the September event, husband and wife, but they'd eaten the same thing. So it's a logical conclusion that perhaps it was food poisoning, it was tainted water, just a bacterial infection.
Well, look, as this investigation progresses and unfolds, what we do know is that the family members who were not affected by the cake, they are just grappling with devastating losses here. 3 family members are dead. 3 others have a long road to recovery. And in the end, it's supposed to be a family holiday celebration meant to be a joyful time of year. And this is now turned into what is really an unthinkable tragedy. Mary Jumbelic, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time, and Happy New Year to you.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.